Hi guys, Eric Knudsen here from Tro Cycling, and in this video I want to talk about base training and what we're trying to do in base and why we're trying to do it. You know, base training is so important for reaching your full potential as a cyclist. And so what I wanted to do is talk about your power profile and how the intervals that you do during base, how that relates to your power profile later on in the season. It's actually really interesting, so let's take a look. So I wanted to explain base training in terms of a power duration profile curve. And I actually get this right out of WKO software. It's literally my favorite graph because it shows so much information and can be used to explain so much. If you are interested in a graph like this and you don't have WKO, you can kind of see what your power duration profile looks like using Training Peaks. Strava actually will show it to you. Zwift will show it to you. They call it your critical power. But really, WKO gives a lot more context around the data so that you can kind of really see what's going on. So let's talk about this graph real quick. On the y-axis here, we have power per weight, so watts per kilogram. And then on the x-axis, we have our duration, so your mean max power for all these various durations. And this is on a log scale, so 1 minute is right here in the middle, and then it's not 2 minutes out here, but an hour. And then what makes this curve really interesting is all these lines that are going across here that represent various categories. Now, these different categories are actually from tens of thousands of user data in Training Peaks, and they represent like actual data. So how this works, they call a men's Cat 5 road, they call fair, and then moderate is a 4, 3, 2, 1, and you can even see how you compare to a world-class World Tour Pro if you're really curious, though it'll be kind of depressing. So now this is actually a male athlete. They have the exact same information for a female. So if I brought up a female, all of the recreational fare, that would all be, they have a database for females too. So you can see that, so it's adjusted correctly. Now the yellow shaded area is the mean max power. This is actual data, and you can kind of see how it goes up, down, up and down. It's kind of smooth, but it's a little zigzaggy. The red dashed line is like a calculated smooth average, and that just allows you to make it a little bit more readable, and it does some other calculations. But let's take a look. Now this is an actual male athlete in race shape. So let's take a look at his power duration curve in the off season. So that's this right here. I think this was November, December, and you can see his power across all these durations is quite a bit lower, as can be expected. He had just been coming off like a 2-week break. But now let's look at what his power duration looks like from the off season to race shape. And that's right here. The bottom is off season and the top is race shape. So now we're talking about base. So the question is, in base training, so the question is, you've got 7 months, 6 months, and you want to know, how do you take a power profile that looks like that bottom line and how do you get it up to the top line? So that's a question that you can kind of think about. One of the obvious ways is just intervals. And basically what interval training is this training near your mean max power for a given duration. So let's take a quick look. For example, and this is kind of interesting. 4 minutes. Let's say we wanted to improve this athlete's 4-minute power. What we would do is, if we would go 4 minutes, we would go up and then we'd hit that line, and let's just say that's about 5 watts per kilogram. What we could do is we could target intervals at 4 minutes, and we would use a power of 5 watts per kilogram. And we'd kind of do this over and over, allowing for proper rest and all of that. Theoretically, if with proper rest, and if we did that for a couple of weeks, he would theoretically come back stronger at that point, because that's what we're trying to do at intervals, is we're trying to really stress that area of the mean max power, and then with proper rest, you'd come back stronger in that duration. So what would happen is his power right at 4 minutes would go up a little bit. And then some of the durations right outside that, maybe a little bit longer and shorter, would come up, as you can probably envision, would come up a little bit too. But in terms of base, if we wanted to move this whole curve up, we wouldn't want to be haphazard with our intervals. We'd want to be really strategic. And so there's an order that we want to go about doing that. So what I want to show you now is a curve that will help. It has a little bit more information, but it'll kind of help to describe and help you to understand why we do things in the order that we do them. Okay, so now we have our power duration here plotted, and we've added in our two energy systems, our aerobic energy system and anaerobic energy system. And what this shows is the contribution percent to your mean max power of each of your different energy systems. So if you add these together, you'll get your mean max power. So let's just take a quick look at that. If you look at 20 seconds, you know it's your anaerobic at 20 seconds. And so that makes sense. If we go up 20 seconds, most of that is all blue, anaerobic. There's a little bit left here to get to meet your mean max power, and that's the aerobic contribution. So even at 20 seconds, you still have a little bit of aerobic contribution. And then vice versa, at 3 hours, you can see that's all aerobic and basically no anaerobic. So it's really useful when you're at whatever power you're riding to just kind of think in the back of your mind of what energy system you're using. So aerobic energy. With oxygen, you're not accumulating enough lactate to really build up, and so that you're not going to fatigue as quicker, so you can go a lot longer. When you're riding anaerobically, it's without oxygen, anaerobic. You're out of breath. Lactate is building up quickly, and you're going to fatigue really quick. Your power is also going to be a lot higher, but you're just not going to be able to maintain it as long. So another key difference between these two energy systems is aerobic energy. It takes a lot longer to develop, but once you stop training it, it'll actually stay around a lot longer, where anaerobic is the complete opposite. You can build it up pretty quickly. A month, you can get your anaerobic system working pretty well. You'd want a little bit more time, but pretty well. And then as soon as you stop training it, it kind of falls off really quickly. So with that in mind, how would you start base? Obviously you'd want to really target your aerobic energy system, and that's exactly what we do in base. So intervals, what I talked about on that last slide with intervals, is really challenging that area of your mean max power. In base, we want to challenge your mean max power, but we don't want to really focus. We don't want to put any effort onto your anaerobic energy system. So we would actually go right here on your power duration profile. We'd want to really test this area right here. And you can see on this area of the curve, you don't have any anaerobic contribution. And so you're really just focusing on your aerobic energy system. And that's exactly what we're doing. Now, before I move on to the next one and really start talking about the intervals, there's 3 good metrics that we can use for measuring how well your anaerobic system or your aerobic system is doing. Is the first is your FTP. That's like the major one. And then you can see on this curve why it's so important. It measures the upper threshold of your aerobic power. It's like a really, really important metric. There's a couple of other ones. If you maximize your FTP and you're just kind of stuck there and maybe you want to work on something else, there's time to exhaustion, your TTE, and that's this point right here where you really start falling off. You really want to, if you can push that out as long as possible, it's really going to benefit you. And then the other one is called stamina, and that's the rate at which your power drops. So now let's talk about intervals that you can do in base training to really kind of bring this up. Okay, so the first type of interval we can do in base is just long endurance rides. And it's just imagine it as one long interval. And that's how I see it. And what we're trying to do in long endurance rides is test really the extreme right side of your mean max power. So if we took a look at this, 3 hours, if we go up, go hit this line right here, and then we go across, we see 200 watts. We could just say, okay, ride at 200 watts for 3 hours, and then with rest, you come back and theoretically we'd be stronger. So how this actually works is that downward part of the curve, when we do long endurance rides like this, we're actually, if we start making improvements, we actually start moving that curve to the right. It's not really up as much as to the right. And if you kind of envision this, if you move that curve to the right, the rest of the curve actually kind of comes along with it. And so you end up improving your FTP by doing that. So you don't necessarily have to just ride right at FTP to improve FTP. You can actually ride quite a bit lower, but for a really long time, and improve your FTP a lot as well. This is how the pros do it. This is almost all they do during base training. So there's long endurance rides. But for us mere mortals, and those of us that have other things to do, we can't possibly get around with just long endurance rides all the time. We don't have the time for that. So there is the next type of interval that I really like. It's really my favorite during all of base is sweet spot. So sweet spot is actually challenging this area of the mean max curve, or your power duration curve right here, just slightly below FTP, about 92%, give or take. And of the many benefits to sweet spot, one really nice thing about sweet spot intervals is, one, it doesn't take as long, so you don't have to ride nearly as long as your long endurance rides, but you can also recover pretty quickly. So you can get away with doing quite a few sweet spot intervals in a week. And with proper rest, it's like the best bang for your buck intervals that you can do during base training. And it's just like long endurance rides, you're moving that curve to the right as much as you can. That's really all you're doing with sweet spot. Now, the third type of interval that you can do in base, and I really like to maybe do it in the second half of base training, is threshold intervals. The threshold intervals they're just a little bit, sweet spot might be 92% of threshold, but threshold interval is right about 100%. The watts might be not that much higher during threshold, but man, they are hard. They're tough intervals, and so that's what they're doing is you're riding right at your functional threshold power, and rather than moving the curve to the right with threshold intervals, it's more, think about it more as just like moving it straight up. So so threshold intervals can be used if you don't have as much time to even do lots of sweet spot work. With threshold intervals, it takes a lot longer to recover, so you want to make sure you have the time for that. And so really, if you're limited on time, what ends up happening is you'll see in a training plan, you'll see everything, the intervals will be more towards the left. So this is kind of like the last. I really like to focus on long endurance, sweet spot, and threshold during base. If you have even less time, let's say you have under 6 hours a week to really train, we might get into some more high intensity intervals where you just don't have the time to work this area of the curve right here. Okay, so now final thoughts on threshold intervals and sweet spot intervals. Now, we don't have to do these intervals all at once. We can split them up and put rest periods in the middle. And really what we're focusing on, especially in these two intervals, is time in zone. We call it TIZ. It's a metric that you'll see me kind of try to spell it out in my training plans quite a bit. And what we're doing is we're really trying to maximize your time in zone so that when you start, we start you on a specific time in zone that we think you can meet. And then what we do is the next week we increase that. And then we increase that, and then we give you a little bit of rest, and then we come back and we increase it. And ultimately what we're doing by doing that is we're taking this area of the curve, stretching it right, moving it up, and really ultimately by doing all that work, really what we're doing is we're just trying to improve your FTP as much as possible, and ultimately just try to maximize the strength and the power of your aerobic engine. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you're able to learn something and just see how important base training season is and kind of what we're trying to do during it. And really, I hope you're motivated to really knock it out of the park this base training season. It's going to make such a difference when the summer rolls around. Your fitness is going to be so much higher the whole time. Like or comment below. I'd love to hear from you.